Good evening, welcome, and Hare Krishna. We are back with the Atma Paradigm, and today we are on session number 5 of part 2, Matter and Reality. And today's subject is the Atma Paradigm model of psychology, how the Atma Paradigm sheds light on various issues within psychology and neuroscience. And we start with, as our usual little previously. But first I wanted to just mention a couple of things. As we go deeper into the Atma Paradigm, it's natural that I'm going to be relying on points that we've previously established in order to keep building up the picture. And it would be impractical for me to have to explain every new point by going back over all the arguments that help to establish that. So particularly the example why we regard consciousness as not being a product of the brain. That is now being taken as a given, if you like, for our argument. Now, that point's been well made, and now we're well into applying the key premise of our paradigm. So I'm assuming your familiarity with the material from previous talks. But where it's helpful, I may make reference to some specific topics. I may even identify the particular talk they came from. And another point, that I'm also aware that in these recent sessions, and also today, I'm going to be introducing some new terms. Now that's inevitable because the standard scientific and philosophical lexicon just doesn't contain the words that we need to serve our purpose. So sometimes I'm going to provide a phrase in English, and sometimes I match it with a Sanskrit word, if that fits. Now the Sanskrit terms may be useful to some of our listeners, and maybe they can help them relate to the terms that I'm using. But they're not really necessary if it's a difficulty for you to try and remember those Sanskrit terms, unless you want to. So previously on the Atma Paradigm, we talked about reality modeled as a continuum of diverse fields. And we've been focusing on 3 fields of discrete functions: consciousness, cognitive functions, and last week we divided them into 3 subcategories, and physical functions, which we divided into 2 subcategories. And here is our basic model laid out. And it's a model of these 3 fields with their specific distinct properties. And just in case it wasn't really clear from last week, although these fields may seem to be ontologically discrete because they exhibit different properties, consciousness, cognitive, and physical, actually they are each facets of a larger reality. And that is something we talked about in an earlier talk. So this larger reality, this that kind of encapsulates our fields, is we've termed the continuum of reality. Now, just one way of thinking of how this can come about is if you use the example of the electromagnetic spectrum. I'm not suggesting we're talking about energy and vibrations here, but just like the electromagnetic spectrum has one part of it that exhibits properties that are visible to us, and other parts that do other things and have other different properties. So similarly, we're just giving this idea that the continuum of reality is able to manifest different properties, but although they seem discrete and different, they have the ability to relate one to another and to share information between each other. So, to sum up from last week, we explained, and I hope we demonstrated this, how the mind, although non-neural, is able to access the information of physical reality, and how the mind adopts the properties of those physical objects and events and then encodes that information in a non-neural, non-physical mental form. Well, more on that today. And we also explained how consciousness, despite being distinct from the mind, from the cognitive functions, is able to connect with and gather information contained within the mind. And we discussed how that happens, how consciousness identifies with the content of the mind and becomes immersed in that content and sees itself as the lead character in the drama that is unfolding on the stage of awareness. So effectively, consciousness, specifically the individual conscious entity, the Atma, becomes the actor on the stage of awareness. So we've now addressed the big philosophical questions we posed for consciousness in our earlier talks. We saw the problems in trying to reduce conscious experience to neural or physical properties and functions, and that's why we suggested that it's reasonable to pursue an alternative to the physicalist notion that the brain is the source of consciousness. And specifically, we proposed that consciousness is a non-neural, non-physical phenomenon, which interacts with the physical world via the interface of a set of non-neural cognitive functions. So now we produced a model with a feasible process by which non-physical consciousness can access information about the physical world without the contravention of physics. And we'll give a bit more on that next week. So that has been the challenge that we set ourselves earlier in these talks. Now, the model we produced, I would suggest, is not only feasible, but the process we outlined last week addressed some of the biggest challenges facing science and the philosophy of mind. And today we're going to test out our model and consider other aspects of psychological perception and conscious experience. And of course, because it's the aspect that's most close to us and easiest to study, we're focusing primarily on human psychology and experience. Another time, we will consider how the same model works for consciousness embodied within other life forms. Now, to help our discussion on how the cognitive functions work for us as individuals, I'm going to adjust the diagram in this slide into a psychological version. If you like, what you're seeing now is the ontological version, and now this one with the green border is our psychological version. Okay, and this is intended to represent each one of us as individual beings and our connection with the cognitive functions and the physical world. So in this diagram, we're talking about consciousness in terms of the individual conscious person, the Atma. Okay, and the cognitive functions are the same, but with the immersion of the Atma taking the role of the persona, i.e. we are focusing on the actor on the stage of awareness rather than the generalized platform of the theatre of awareness. So we see that the actor is present within this diagram of our model. And in the physical functions, they've been changed. Now, instead of representing them in terms of protophysical information and physical properties, we're now being very specific. We are including the facets of the physical world with which we are most closely and intimately connected. Our body, its group of senses, and the brain. And we'll be looking at how all of these fields and all of these aspects that we have shown here interact with one another. So I'm suggesting that we have 3 levels of psychology. The conscious functions of the individual, the Atma, the cognitive functions in these 3 subcategories, and the physical being of brain, body, and senses. And let me go through those with you. The primary level of consciousness, P1, that is the Atma, the conscious self. It has its own psychological drivers, and we'll be exploring more of those as we go further into our talks next week and beyond. Then we have the secondary level. Now this is the bit that is mind, and you might have thought that's the only bit of psychology. No, we're considering this the secondary level of psychology because it takes its lead from the drivers emanating from the Atma. So secondary level in 3 parts. S1 is the persona, the actor on the stage of awareness. S2, the secondary bit, is the gatekeeper of discerning intelligence. And S3 is what we called last week the pool of the mind. We discussed them all last week, but we're going to spend a little bit more time on each of these and how they work together, and particularly how they work with the brain and the body. But first, I'm going to do a quick run through, a little circular run through of these 3 secondary functions, secondary level of psychology, of the cognitive functions, before we move on to the brain and body. So, go back over our understanding of the persona. This is the actor on the stage of awareness. And this persona, excuse me, embodies the concept of the character we are playing. It's the sense of who we are. And it is derived from an amalgamation of all the various conceptions we have of ourselves. And these arise from our physical bodies, our skills, our attributes, our mental outlook, our sense of who we are in relationship to society and the external world, and also what we believe about our place and purpose in the whole of reality, all wrapped up in this persona. And the persona interprets the drives of the Atma in accord with those self-concepts. Thus, the persona character sets the agenda for all subsequent psychology in terms of interests, wants, motivations. And if we are to sum up what that agenda might be, I'd suggest it could be expressed as gratify me. The character on the stage just wants to be gratified. And I think that's a great word to describe and pull these different things together. So the persona thus determines the parameters, the preferences, and the filters to be used by the next level, the gatekeeper of discerning intelligence. This is the discerning or discriminative function of intelligence. As we said, it's not IQ or EQ, it's the ability to focus, to decide and to determine what is good, what is not, what is helpful, what is not, what is preferable, what is not, and so on. And the intelligence, and I'll often just reduce this down to saying the intelligence, is responsible for attention, for focus, and for directing the mind. The gatekeeper has to acknowledge the agenda set by the persona actor, and it aims to fulfill that agenda by devising protocols or guidelines for the mind. And one way of thinking about this, so these sort of guidelines that the intelligence of the gatekeeper is setting, is that they could be likened like the preferences and filters you might set up on your computer or your phone. What are you interested in? What do you want to be notified about? These are the sort of filters that the intelligence sets up based on the agenda set by the persona. And these define how responsive the gatekeeper and the mind will be to the various stimuli that come in. For instance, if there's a smell of food, does that get absolute attention regardless of what else is going on? Or if the mind gathers the image of someone attractive, will everything else being processed at the time be dismissed? So these preferences are intended to guide the activities of the pool of the mind, and in different ways, to attend to any stimulus that may match the agenda, to keep the mind focused on matters of significance, and to review and revise the narratives that are being developed within the pool of the mind. And I'll explain how all these work in more detail. This is an overview at the moment. But basically the mind follows these preferences as its guidelines. And they influence how the mind directs the senses towards gathering particular sensory imagery, sound, sensation, taste, and so on. And the guidelines also influence what the mind pulls out of its deep pool, which memories or recollections might be relevant. And also how it then conceives of new ideas, desires, and plans to fit in with the goals and objectives that have been set. Now, this isn't a kind of linear process. There's a sort of interplay that is going on between the gatekeeper and the pool of the mind. It's dynamic as they bring together kind of a whole wave of sensory impressions, ideas, propositions, reviewing and accepting, looking at each mental component. Is this suitable? Fitting them together to form a flow of integrated thoughts and reflections. And all of this is building into a narrative. And that will then be passed, ready down the line, for us to experience as a sort of stream of consciousness. So, some of this deliberation in building the narrative may seem to go back and forward over opposing thoughts. we may experience it in our minds. We, as a kind of voices going back and forward on different points. You know, oh, this is a good idea. No, that may not be. You know, maybe you could worry about this, and so on. This is the sort of stuff that is coming to us. But one of the interesting aspects is we cannot be sure that we are consciously aware of the whole story that is being presented to us. What are the thoughts and ideas that we are not hearing from the mind? We only, by definition, we only know the ones that we are hearing. But what are the ones that we're not hearing? Is there a bias in all of this? Has the mind and intelligence been selective and perhaps unfair or uneven in how it's presenting opposing arguments? Now, by definition, we can't tell. But we do know that the mind contains much subconscious stuff. For instance, we know that there are many sensory impressions coming in from our senses at every moment, but most of them we're not consciously aware of. And we gave that example that now that I say, how are your feet doing? Now you realize actually your feet touching the floor have been sending data up to you, which you could have been experiencing. But most of the time we're not. We're not paying attention to so much of what is feeding into our brains and our minds, and even there must be thoughts and other stuff in our mind that we are not getting to hear. So this is a function of the gatekeeper as discerning intelligence to discerning intelligence. So in order to focus or spotlight the specific things we attend to. And I just want to kind of introduce you to a little exercise that we can do in this regard. And here it is. This is attention. I just want to make sure we've got the mic on for this. Okay, you can hear it. What I want you to do is follow this very attentively. It only lasts about 30 seconds. Follow it very attentively, and then I've got a question for you. Okay, now my question is, how many sounds could you hear at any one moment? Not in total, but at any one moment. How many sounds? There's a little poll on this one. If you're on Facebook and have access to that, you could put your answer in. Now, the interesting aspect of this, I'm going to give away what I think is the answer, is that really you only heard one distinct sound at any one time. You're only aware of one. Now, you may have been aware that others might be happening, but in order to hear them, you had to shift your attention from one to the other. And as soon as then some other noise started, your mind shifted to that one. So this is just a little exercise that demonstrates how the intelligence is used to focus the mind on particular impressions that are coming in. And it indicates that our conscious awareness is selective. Certain aspects in the brain are chosen for attention. Certain aspects in the mind are chosen for attention. Others may not be. And our awareness is therefore partial. We only experience a portion of the available mental content. Now we turn to the tertiary levels of our model of psychology. These are the physical bits, and the brain, the senses, and the body. Now, this might seem odd that we are counting them as psychological because we label them physical, but their functions and inputs are very much linked to sensory stimulus and its responses, and they provide the data, or much of the data, for cognitive processing. They're the physical components of our sensory reception. So they definitely play a very big part in our psychology. So most of our everyday experiences and perception are set off from this level. It's the contact of our senses that connects us to the wonderful features of the outside world. You know, so many things to see, to hear, to smell, and to do. And they are all the sensations arising from our physical body. They're also feeding into us, and they definitely affect how our mind is operating. Because these sensations from the body, like aches and pains or feelings of hunger, thirst, tiredness, and so on, they definitely feed in and affect us. So all of this data is coming into the pool of the mind. Now let's have a look at the flow of that information and how it is processed. And we're including the body and brain this time. So this is a general overview of how perception works. And later on we're going to look at a few specific and special examples. So we start with the body and its senses. Information of the world floods in by our senses into our brains, and there you see the little arrows setting off neural activity, these flashes in the brain. Now, I've got to say, it may seem that over this series I've been giving a lot of bad press to the brain. You know, I've been disparaging it in many ways. I've complained that it cannot produce subjective consciousness. I've criticized it that it cannot produce quality. I've even, accused it that it does not have the data to produce satisfactory perception. And I'm going to tell you a few more deficiencies even today. But that doesn't mean the brain isn't important. It really is. It is a vital organ of the body, and as such there is a very close link between it and the non-neural mind. In fact, what I think is that we will start to see how much credit the mind gives to it in a few ways. Because the brain is a physical organ coordinating the inputs of all our physical sensory data, and also the outputs of the motor that go from the brain to our limbs and organs and gets them to do stuff, the motor actions. So it's worth mentioning that neither the Sankhya nor the Yoga analysis of perception and action mention the brain. Those treatises have a different emphasis and perspective of how these processes work. But I do not believe that they are actually at odds or contradictory with the Atma Paradigm or with the idea that the brain is important. Each of these aspects kind of offers insights into the wonderful functions of the mind. So what we're looking at today is, because we know now a lot about the functions of the brain, we can tie its abilities into the workings of the non-neural mind, and that will help reveal quite a few interesting aspects, which then tie back into other ways of analyzing the mind and the senses and so on. And today, what I want to get across is just how faithfully the mind tries to acknowledge brain content. And it seems to me that the mind sees its mental role as enhancing brain content as best as possible for our experience. Now, why would that be? Well, perhaps it is to provide the Atma as the actor on the stage with the best possible experience of what it is like to inhabit a physical body and to experience the world through the senses and limbs of that body. So the mind gathers the data from brain activity. Here it is now as stars in the pool of the mind. And as we discussed last week, the mind enhances that data with additional proto-physical data. We've dealt with that. I'm not going to discuss that much in detail today. But these stars that are now produced within the mind from that data, from the physical stuff, from the brain, from the proto-physical, the mind is producing what I'm going to call mental icons. These are individual bits of imagery, sensations and sounds and so on. And I use the word icon as you do in computing, in the idea that an icon is a pictogram or an ideogram. For example, an emoticon is an icon that represents an emotion. So a mental icon, as I'm defining it, is the something representing a sensory quality, such as an image or a sound, or an idea, a thought, a sensation, an emotion. Each individual one of these bits of mental things I'm calling a mental icon. So, at this stage in the process, these mental icons are not experienced yet. So they are latent, potential state of mental content that could be experienced. But it is only by the action of intelligence, focusing on them, that they come to our awareness. Now, just I'm going to throw in a little Sanskrit here, these mental icons, these individual bits of imagery, etc., are known from the Yoga Sutras as pratyaya. Now, question could be raised, how do we know that these mental icons are actually mental and within the non-neural mind? Now, I'm going to give an answer to that using the example and evidence of another form of remote viewing. Last week we did coordinate remote viewing as produced by Stanford Research Institute. Now we're using another one because it's more pertinent to this question. And this other experiments into remote viewing was done by a section of Princeton University's engineering faculty under the title Princeton Engineering Anomalous Research, or PAIR for short. And PAIR referred to the phenomenon of remote viewing that they were studying as precognitive remote perception. Now, the system they used was different to what we described last week. Basically, they set out agents to a particular target. And there you see the small blue box, lower down, agents at the scene. So you've got an agent at the scene there, and you've got the percipient or the viewers sitting wherever. Now the agent of the scene is viewing some object, some place, in this case it looks like some buildings, and getting information. And that information is being read by the viewers sitting in a distant place. So somehow there is mind-to-mind access. They are tuning into the minds of the target persons and the agents and obtaining imagery and other sensory icons associated with the target person's personal experience. Now, an interesting aspect of the methodology that PAIR developed was that they used a special type of questionnaire which had binary descriptor questions. So yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Or, and the agent filled that out for his target, and the percipients also filled out the same questionnaire. So that provided data that could be analyzed statistically. And the results that PAIR published said, the overall results of these analyses leave little doubt by any criterion that the PRP perceptions contain considerably more information about the designated targets than can be attributed to chance guessing. So this is evidence of mind-to-mind communication, and what is being transmitted seems to be in the format of what we are calling mental icons, imagery, sounds, ideas, and so on. So I think this helps to establish the point that our mental icons are real and they are contained non-neurally within the non-neural mind. Now, just in case you think that, well, experiments with people, maybe they're a little dodgy, here's another experiment. And this is Brenda Dunn. Now, she was the laboratory manager for PAIR for many, many, many years. And she was responsible for the PRP experiments that they ran. And a couple of years ago, a few of us from the Bhaktivedanta Institute got to visit her in her home in Princeton. And one of the things we were discussing was she showed us this picture and asked what we thought it was. And we looked, well, a flower, maybe it's an orchid. And she said, yep. But this drawing or painting wasn't done by a human, but by a parrot, Nikisi. Nikisi is an African grey parrot, and they're known for being smart, but Nikisi is exceptional, it seems. So they reckon Nikisi, the parrot here, has a vocabulary of several thousand words. And its owner, Amy Morgana, who's shown here, noticed that Nikisi would often start speaking words to tally with what she was reading or thinking. And this led to a set of experiments in which Amy and Nikisi were separated in different rooms of the building with no ability to communicate physically. And cameras and mics were set up to record each of them simultaneously. Then Amy opened sealed envelopes with photographs and pictures. Now, Nikisi had no way of knowing physically when or if Amy opened an envelope, but on 19 of the occasions when she had a picture in front of her, Nikisi responded with keywords directly describing that image. And here is a few examples. The image here is of a flower. It's not a very good way of showing it, but listen to Nikisi's response. The voice you are hearing is the parrot. Now, here's a couple more. I haven't got the audio for this, unfortunately, but the picture, can I give you a hug? Your hug? And he keeps using this word hug, hug, when he sees that he's getting something through on this. And then on this one, what you doing on the phone? Now, one of the reviewers of that these experiments said that the experiment had shown a concordance between Nikisi's phrases and the card images that Morgana had viewed. And that cannot be explained by chance and doesn't appear to be explainable by methodological error. So somehow here we have mind to mind, not between humans, but between a human and a parrot. And now, although Nikisi knows the names of many objects, we're not suggesting Nikisi necessarily understands all of the language or phrases that he speaks. It seems that he understands some of them. But what is clear that in this case, he is tuning into Amy's thoughts about the pictures. And so some aspects of the mental icons that she has obtained from looking at the pictures are being transferred or communicated to Nikisi in such a fashion that he is able to recognize and even articulate what the object or the icon is. So it's not clear, is he saying the words flower, hug, phone because he has received a visual image? We don't know. Or is he repeating the words that make up Amy's thoughts? We don't know. So is he getting some other information from the information field like we talked last week and verbalizing his own experience? We're not sure. But in any case, this seems to be evidence that sensory imagery received into the mind is now in a form of mental stuff with psychological properties. And these two experiments together indicate that they can be transmitted mind to mind. And now another question about the mental icons. We were discussing the mental icons arising from the input of our senses, and only some, we talked about this earlier, and only some of them are presented through for our awareness. So what happens to the others? Do they just disappear? This raises the subject of memory, how it's stored and retrieved. And our model suggests that all mental icons that enter the mind are preserved. They are stored as memory impressions deep within the pool of the mind. And these include both those icons that are included in awareness and those that weren't. So both those that we're conscious of and those that remained subconscious. And the Sanskrit term, here we go again, for these stored mental impressions is samskars. Now, this word samskar is used in different ways in the Vedic tradition, but from the Yoga Sutras, when it is talking about samskars, it is talking about those impressions that are held deep within our memory. And I use the words impressions in the sense that these are icons that have left a readable imprint, something that can be retrieved at a future date. So it's accepted that sensory inputs that we haven't been consciously aware of can be retrieved, and we know that through hypnosis. So they must exist somehow or somewhere. And this is the Atma Paradigm approach to modeling how our memory works. Yeah, but you might say, well, yeah, but we've been told memories are stored within the brain. If you have, they may have been overstressing that. Yeah, it's the assumption on behalf of the brain model that memory must be stored in the brain, because otherwise, where else? How else? But up to now, there is no conclusive theory or evidence of that it works or how it works. So the issue of how memories are stored and accessed is a neurological mystery and still hotly debated. What seems to be the case is the brain has a system that we can call RAM, random access memory, like a computer. This deals with the inputs of the brain over a very short period, and they're of two types. There's the sensory memory and short-term working memory. But the brain seems to be missing ROM. It has no read-only memory, so it has no long-term storage of memories. And it is certainly not like the picture at the top. There are no files, there are no storage cupboards, your memories are not present as stored data. So here's a diagram of the three types of memories that we seem to use. Sensory memory, these are the sensory inputs that arrive in the brain but fade within a few seconds, very, very quick. It said you can probably get up to 3 to 7 bits of data can be held at any one moment, and then they're gone. But your working memory tries to hold on to some of those as they're coming in, and some new ones and some other new ones. It tries to hold on to chunks of information in order to process meaning in sentences or calculations or thought streams. So you have to work hard at holding on to the earlier bits in order to complete a mental task. That is a function of intelligence. So if we try any mental arithmetic, take your age, multiply it by 3, add 19 and so on. You've really got to work hard holding on to all those instructions and carrying them out. But the one that we're interested really here are long-term memories. And these also are in two parts. There is implicit, which includes subconscious memory linked to keeping the body working, and also cell and muscle memory related to skills. Okay, so that's kind of built in somehow there. Explicit. Now this is the bit that we really count as our memory. This is sometimes called declarative memory. And it's all the things that we normally associate. Episodic or autobiographical things, all the events and experiences of our life. So that's one type. And semantic memory. These are the facts and the figures and all the concepts and the things you learn at school and you cram for in exams. So the neuroscience has this statement that it believes long-term memory to be infinite and permanent, which is a pretty big statement because it seems that that is the case, but as yet no one knows how or where it happens. Really, the only aspects that have been kind of explored is that we need to have some type of encoding, we need some type of storage, and we need some type of retrieval. But there is no engram. There is no individual memory trace. There's no neuron or set of neurons that represents the whole memory. It's not like a file that you put, a paper file you put in a drawer. It's not even like your computer file system. What seems to be the case is that after initial firing, a group of neurons in particular parts of the brain are primed to fire together. And this is a kind of principle that neurons that fire together wire together. So the idea is if a group of neurons have fired together once, they may do it again. And sometimes there is when you try to lay these memories down, there is repeated firing, which then establish what is called the old memory trace. That is a group of neurons who have fired together once or maybe more times and may be willing to do the same, but they don't represent the whole memory. This is a tiny number of neurons which represents just one little element of that experience. Not enough data to produce it, and certainly not enough to, and there's then of course the quality issue as well. So how are these activated? What neurons have to fire to get these ones to fire in the correct pattern, and to get them to fire here and there and everywhere around the brain at the same time, wherever else the bits of that memory are meant to be located? What sets them off? It actually seems to be a very seriously haphazard process. And how are each of these separate memory traces located in different parts of the brain tied together to produce a coherent, full memory of an event? Remember we talked about the binding problem in session 1.4? We cannot even understand how it does it for present conscious stuff. How does the brain do it for these kind of memory traces scattered here and there throughout the brain? There's no theoretical mechanism that has been established on this yet. So overall, brain model theories are considered incomplete at best. Now, this is a function. The retrieval of storage within the brain needs bigger coordination. And this is one of the key examples where mental functions lead brain activity. Now, that's a strong statement. And of course, it seems at odds with the standard assumption that brain activity must come first. That's the brain model. Brain activity produces thoughts. But there are many instances, and we'll be talking over some of them in these sessions, where this assumption is not the case. In certain situations, the mind responds to what seems as the independent stimulation of brain activity, but there are other situations where the brain needs its coordination of disparate brain data. It needs something beyond itself in order to coordinate its activity, such as the initiation of memory traces. And actually, the memory traces are subsequent to their retrieval by intelligence from the pool of the mind, as we've tried to show here in our little diagram. And that activity between the intelligence and the mind activates neural activity and creates a matching activity of mind and thoughts with it, and neural activity within the brain. So we'll be presenting more on this aspect of how the non-neural mind helps to coordinate brain activity and affect it. That's one of the big topics next week. So, as well as the mental icons received from the senses, the mind retrieves memories of previous events and activities, and old ideas that have been stored within the pool. So here they are. We have sensory stimuli that can evoke what might have felt like long lost forgotten memories. And one of the most powerful of those is, of course, the sense of smell. You might have ever entered a place and the fragrance just sets up a kind of really deep remembrance of a past event there or elsewhere. Now, all impressions that enter the pool of the mind are stored as memory impressions by the gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper plays a crucial role in their recall. And it determines which memory impressions are retrieved. And recalled memories are now new mental icons. Once they're brought up, they're experienced as new mental icons, reconstructed from the aspects of the impression or samskara memory that we are able to gather. So the imagery of the pool in this idea of recall and retrieval is appropriate. And the Yoga Sutras talk about this. The idea is that if you have a peaceful, if I should explain that the Yoga Sutras explain that all our memories settle down to the bottom of this big pool. And if you have a peaceful, unagitated mind, the pool is clear. There's no ripples, so it's easy to look down, to locate, to access and recall stored memories. But if our mind is too active or agitated or preoccupied, the pool will seem turbulent. There's ripples and waves on it, and it's hard to kind of see clearly. So it's harder to access those memories. But if our minds are highly disturbed, distressed, or even polluted, then the pool will seem cloudy, silty, and it's very hard to find a memory and retrieve it with clarity. It might seem simplistic as an analogy, but actually this system, of course, is what is being applied in many Gurukul schools in India following the old kind of styles, where they have based their learning techniques on this model in order to help the students develop phenomenal abilities of recall. They can absorb incredible quantities of information and be able to bring it back perfectly. Anyway, the key principle that we're suggesting here is that for certain cognitive processes, the functions of the non-neural mind lead the neural activity of the brain. Now, and this is as this is happening, the mind is formulating lots of new ideas. So it's got this sensory stimulus, but those are bringing new memories up. And of course, if you bring memories up, they'll kind of formulate new ideas. So that's the light bulbs going off. And then these ideas are kind of setting off requirement for new memories, which are generating new ideas. And the whole thing is just kind of going on and on. So we've got a whole melee of mental icons arriving from our senses, plus the recalled memories of previous related experiences, those that were happy and those that were not. And these contribute to the generation of new thoughts and ideas. For example, do I want to do this again? Or why didn't it work out well last time? And the mind starts its debate, accepting and rejecting propositions and generating new ones. So the intelligence is active, helping to weave together the narratives of thoughts, sensations, and emotions, and bringing them together as a stream of consciousness, or what you can call. This weaving together addresses a big problem, as I said, within the brain model concerning binding. And they haven't identified a system for how integration of thoughts and impressions works. We suggest that this system is not part of the neural setup. It does not have its own system for that. At least the brain does not initiate or control that system. The process is led by the activities of the mind and intelligence. And all of these activities of integration produce a packet of integrated thoughts and sensations. And each of these packets of information is known as and I'm going to use the Sanskrit term, a vritti, a mental package. So a vritti is more powerful than an individual icon or individual memory. Probably we never actually experience mental icons or memories on their own. They're almost always wrapped up as a package of visuals, memory, ideas, sensations, all together as a vritti. So these discrete packages of vritti run together and form a narrative, this stream of mental material. And it's a flow of vrittis. And it is this narrative of these packets that captivates us entirely. And this narrative is now what is being presented within the theatre of awareness. So the sensations and perceptions that we experience as the Atma arise from our absorption as that character, that actor. This is us. This is who we believe we are. And therefore what is coming to us all around, and we're just immersed in this narrative. And we believe that's everything about us. That's what we're doing. That's what we're experiencing. And to tie in that very important word we talked about earlier, qualia. Qualia are the qualities of these perceptions that we have when they come through to us in this way. They're the qualities of the pictures that we are understanding the world to be, of the sounds we understand the world to be, of the thoughts that we understand going on within our mind. These are the qualities of all those perceptions. So there's obviously a close relation between the properties of the mental icons and qualia. Now, just to kind of be clear on this difference between what we mean by awareness as opposed to consciousness. You know, I'm using awareness in that what we become aware of, rather than the ability of consciousness to be aware of things. So there's obviously a relationship between consciousness and awareness, but they're not the same concept. Awareness is what is what is happening when we experience mental stuff. Awareness fluctuates. And at times it appears to stop, and other times it starts. So it's not a synonym for consciousness. And sometimes I think conflating the two has led to poorly conceived notions that consciousness is not a permanent phenomenon. And that leads to many of the anomalies within the brain model. And I mention this because we're just about to look at the aspect of sleep. Sleep is a function that the intelligence plays. Intelligence plays an important role for memory, but it's also linked to sleep. Sleep is really helpful to us. We need sleep. At least your persona does. It's hard work for the conscious entity, maintaining awareness in our body and mind. We need to take a break to recover. So to fall asleep, intelligence needs to close the gate to the mind. As long as the mind is acting, sending thoughts, plans, worries through to our conscious awareness, as long as intelligence is trying to focus on things, you are not going to experience the sleeping state. However, in the dream state, intelligence sort of relaxes the restriction. So this strict red line is now broken up. And at this time, there's little or no sensory inputs arriving into the mind. And the mind still wants to be active during this period. So what it does, it gathers the memories. It gathers the sanskars from within its pool. And often these relate to the memory impressions that have been laid down that day. Some of them are older, and some of them are related to current fears or hopes or aspirations or long-term anxieties. And they all float up into the pool. They probably barely relate to one another. And the mind, which doesn't seem to get a lot of help from the intelligence, starts trying to put them together. So the end result is crazy. They involve unrelated imagery, events, thoughts, and experiences. And the result is just this incredibly weird narrative of things happening to you, all mixed up. There was one psychological study that tried to get a group of people to think of the weirdest possible dream scenarios they could. So they were trying to write mad stuff. And they concluded that not even our wildest imagination can come up with anything as bizarre as our actual dreams. So in general, dreams seem to be without message or purpose. But this is the consolidation of our autobiographical memory. Actually, this is important for identifying sanskars that we will call on. And there may be more to our dreams. Perhaps they let us act out ideas that would be impractical or wrong or bad if we really did them. Perhaps we get to fulfill some desires without having to go through all the troubles that they might involve. Perhaps in some instances, dreams allow us to hear or learn something from a source deep within. But what happens within deep sleep? Now, during deep sleep or at other times when we appear to lose total consciousnness, what is happening at this point? It seems that consciousness stops. Now, this might happen, I'm calling it blackout, in short for all those, could be from fainting or from trauma, illness, whatever, or of course during anesthesia. Now, the understanding is that at these times there's disruption between the senses and the mind. The senses may even still be active in sending data to the brain, but it is not being accessed by the mind. There is a yogic explanation why that is. Nor does the mind try to stimulate memories or generate dreams. Basically, the mind transmits nothing to the theater of awareness. And that is experienced like this. Now, as they used to say when televisions went on the blink, do not adjust your set. Screen is black. In these cases of deep sleep or fainting or apparent unconsciousness, you are never actually unconscious as the Atma. Conscious as the function of the Atma never stops. It is not turned on or off. Rather, the situation is that on a psychological level, you have nothing to be conscious of. Your senses and mind are not feeding you anything. There's nothing happening on the stage. It's a blank. The theater of awareness is in total darkness. If you're absorbed in the screen, as I hope you are, you have not stopped existing, as I hope, just because your screen has gone dark. But you are no longer experiencing something other than my voice. So without the input from the senses and the mind, there is nothing to engage your character on the stage. The persona therefore loses its sense of identification with the material body. And because you have nothing to experience during this period and nothing to remember about it afterwards, you take it that you have been unconscious. But sometimes there are just enough sensations creeping through the darkness, like they are on the screen now. So similarly, whilst asleep, in deep sleep, the Atma sometimes has a sense of having experienced a sort of mental nothingness as something. So it's aware that it's experiencing nothing, which it means that it's experiencing something of that aspect of seeing almost nothingness. And because of that, we may therefore feel we enjoyed a deep sleep of blissful oblivion. Now, I was going to look at a number of other states of awareness, but I think my time is running long. So I am going to just go to our conclusions. And I'll keep those other slides for next week. Now, in previous week, and so I suggested this is a good opportunity to send through any questions. In previous weeks, I suggested that our model of the three fields offers an explanation of the relationship of consciousness to the mind, and from the mind to the physicality of the body, brain, and external world. Now, this week, I've tried to present the same structure, but in a modified form as a model for use in psychology. And I tried to demonstrate how this model sheds light on processes that occur within our minds and perception. I didn't get to give all the examples I hoped to. But anyway, I still hope that that it actually helps to show how valuable this model of psychology might be. Now, some people might challenge the claim and say that, well, maybe it's just all of this is the actions of the brain. However, even though there may be some theories about some little bits of how the neuroscience can explain or correlates with particular psychology things, the difficulty is the overall thesis of the brain being responsible for all aspects of consciousness is not established. That's what's failed. And I'd suggest that if you're going to have a satisfactory theory of the nature of consciousness, it has to encompass all aspects of subjectivity, awareness, perception, as well as psychological experience. Don't just give me some of the easy bits and say, this proves the brain is doing it. No. On its own, the brain cannot explain the full range. Now, I'm not going to claim that all the details I presented on these topics are comprehensive, and I'm not going to say they aren't beyond improvement. But my purpose was to highlight the opportunities for further research using this kind of consciousness-based perspective of the mind and how it links with the brain, body, and reality. That's the contribution I believe that the Atma Paradigm can make to psychology and neuroscience. Often when I'm speaking in groups where I know there are psychologists or psychiatrists, I suggest, even if you don't want to consider or accept the metaphysics or the ontology of this model, still this model is so much more useful than trying to fit everything about neurology and psychology into the brain. Using this Atma Paradigm model, you can locate the cause and symptoms of various disorders within these different levels, whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary, or one of their subdivisions. You can locate where the disorder lies, and you can also then apply targeted therapies. So, just to give a summary, the concept of the three fields of the continuum provides a model for use in psychology. And we've given evidence that mental impressions are indeed non-neural. So this model offers insights into aspects of everyday perception, sleep, dreaming, and states of non-awareness. It talks about, we've given some ideas for the formation, storage, and retrieval of memories. And although I haven't given the details, I've hinted at their ability to deal with the nature and potential treatment of mental disorders. And what our analysis has indicated is how much of our conscious awareness is determined by the input of our senses, how our brains fire. But what the mind picks up and how it integrates all of that with memories and new ideas, that's the interesting aspect. It does seem that the mind is doing its best to be faithful to what the brain is picking up. It's being faithful to how your body, your senses, your brain are working. And it is trying to give you the best possible experience in that accord with the body and brain. So, It makes it seem that in this picture, the Atma is simply a passive recipient of the drama unfolding on the stage of the theatre. This is not the full picture. It's true that a huge amount of what we do experience is delivered to us, but we are not entirely passive. And next week, we're going to set about looking at what I think is even the more fascinating aspect of consciousness. It's free will and volition. Now, we are already at our hour level, so that is pretty late. If you are disappearing now, then no one will blame you. But let me just see if we have any questions. And the first question I see is, how does the conscious observer affect its influence on the intelligence? Great question, and exactly what we will be looking at in detail next week. And is there any medical application for mental health to understanding our mind as non-neural? I think so. Certainly, I've said that there is really value in understanding the nature of the breakdown of the different kind of facets of the mind and the Atma, separating consciousness, the cognitive functions, from simple neurology. Give you one quick example. Obsessive compulsive disorder. This isn't just about keeping your house clean or arranging all your CDs in alphabetical order. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a frightening situation. But it involves two different things. It involves a neurological component. There is some neuron in your brain which is firing and setting off, being interpreted by the mind that neuron firing represents a particular thought. So the mind is interpreting that firing as, did I lock the front door? And then, because that thought has come up, you then go about trying to deal with that and go and sort out your front door. But the fires again, did I lock the front door? I'm sure I don't know if I did, maybe I didn't. And it's that repeated firing is setting off the thoughts. Now, the firing alone isn't the problem. The big problem for the individual is that their mind is torturing them with its deliberations about the worry over that front door and what it needs to do and what panic that is setting in. So there's two ways of dealing with this, and what they have found is that they can use some kind of electrical treatment on the neurons, and that has some effect, at least for a time. However, it is equally, possibly more important, to address the psychological and to train the mind not to respond to that particular firing, not to kind of interpret it as I left the front door, to change the mental icon that it is associating with that firing. So I think that's just one example of how this can really help in applications of therapy. But I apologize, I'm now well over my time. And if you're still with us, thank you very much. We'll see you next week. And next week is volition and free will. So 6 p.m. UK time, whatever it is elsewhere in the world for you. And on Thursday the 23rd, we'll see